The days felt long at the diner, but the work was steady. I found a rhythm there, behind the counter, where I washed dishes, cleaned tables, and kept to myself. The owner, a man named Roy, seemed to like me well enough, mostly because I didn't talk back. But there was something off about him. Sometimes, when he thought no one could hear, he'd talk about customers in ways that made my stomach turn. His words would come out low, but they were sharp, cutting into my ears like knives, full of hate and disdain for people he pretended to smile at. He saved his smiles for those he thought were worth it, folks with the right skin color or the right kind of clothes. I'd hear him mutter after they left, ugly things that made me want to quit right there. But I kept my mouth shut and kept working. I needed the job, needed the money, and I didn't want trouble. Then there was Anna. She was one of the regulars, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, 2 sugars, and a blueberry muffin, no butter. She'd sit at the counter, reading some novel, lost in her own world. She never bothered anyone, and I found myself curious about her. One day, I made the mistake of smiling at her when I brought her coffee. "Why are you smiling at her?" Roy asked, his voice low, but I could hear the anger simmering beneath it. I shrugged. "Just being polite," he sneered. "You think she's gonna tip you extra for a smile?" People like her don't care about people like us. I wanted to ask what he meant by people like us, but I didn't. I knew better. Still, his words stayed with me. I wondered how he could be so hateful, so quick to judge. But then, I saw it. How he treated everyone who wasn't like him, anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. One day, I was in the back, scrubbing a stubborn pot, when I heard Roy talking to someone in the front. His voice was louder than usual, and I could hear the disgust dripping from every word. "Look at that guy," he was saying. "Think he can just walk in here and sit wherever he wants. Damn shame is what it is." I peeked out through the door and saw a young man, maybe in his 20s, dark-skinned and wearing a clean, pressed shirt. He looked like he was just passing through, maybe stopping for a quick meal. But Roy's face was twisted into a scowl. I watched as Roy walked over to the young man's table, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched. "We're full," he said flatly, even though the diner was half empty. The young man looked around, confused. "But there are plenty of seats." Roy didn't back down. "I said we're full. You need to leave." The man hesitated, glanced around, then slowly got up, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. As he walked past me, I could see the pain in his eyes, the silent question of why he wasn't welcome. I felt a lump in my throat. I wanted to say something, to tell him it wasn't fair, but I knew better. Roy caught my eye and shook his head, a warning in his gaze. That was the first time I thought about quitting, but I stayed. I stayed because I needed the job, needed the money, needed to eat. But something had shifted inside me. Roy was a racist, no doubt about it. And I was stuck working for him, every day feeling a little more trapped, a little more disgusted. The next day, when Anna came in, she smiled at me. "Morning," she said, her voice light, like she didn't know the world could be so heavy. I smiled back, but it felt different, like there was a weight on my shoulders. As I poured her coffee, I wondered how long I could keep pretending that what was happening around me didn't matter. But it did matter, and it was about to get worse. A week passed, and the air in the diner grew thicker with tension. I started to notice things more, the way Roy would look at certain customers, the way his mouth curled into a sneer when he thought no one was looking. I kept my head down, trying to do my job without drawing attention. But every day it got harder to ignore the way he treated people who didn't fit his narrow idea of what was acceptable. Then came the day when everything started to change. It was a Saturday afternoon, busier than usual. The diner was packed, and I was rushing back and forth, trying to keep up with the orders. Anna was there, at her usual spot at the counter, her book open beside her coffee. She seemed more animated than usual, her eyes scanning the room as if she were looking for something. And then he walked in. I recognized him immediately. The young man Roy had turned away the week before. He looked more determined this time, his face set with a quiet resolve. He walked straight to the counter and took a seat right next to Anna. I felt a tightness in my chest as I watched Roy's face darken from across the room. Roy's voice cut through the diner like a knife. "You again?" he said, louder than necessary, drawing the attention of everyone around. The young man didn't flinch. He turned slowly to face Roy, his eyes steady. "Yes, me again," he said calmly. "I'd like a coffee, please." I could feel the tension rising, a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Anna looked up from her book, her brow furrowed with concern. Roy stepped closer, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. "I told you last time," he hissed. "We don't serve your kind here." A murmur spread through the diner, customers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some turned away, pretending not to hear, while others watched with interest, like they were waiting for a show to start. The young man didn't back down. He kept his gaze locked on Roy. "All I want is a cup of coffee," he said softly. "I have the money to pay for it." Roy slammed his hand down on the counter, making the dishes rattle. "I said get out!" he shouted, his face red with anger. "We don't serve troublemakers here." I felt my heart racing, a mix of fear and anger coursing through me. I knew I should keep my head down, keep quiet, but I couldn't help myself. "He's not causing any trouble, Roy," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "He just wants a coffee." Roy whipped around to face me, his eyes blazing. "You stay out of this," he snarled. "You don't know what you're talking about." But it was too late. The young man had seen an opening, a crack in Roy's armor. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice louder now, filling the room. "Why won't you serve me? What's the real reason?" Roy looked like he was about to explode. "The reason?" he spat. "The reason is people like you don't belong here. You come in thinking you can just... That's enough." Anna's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stood up, her eyes blazing with anger. "You can't talk to him like that," she said, her voice steady and strong. "He has every right to be here, just like anyone else." For a moment, the whole diner went silent. Roy looked stunned, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I could see his hands trembling, the fury boiling just beneath the surface. And then, he turned on Anna. "You think you can tell me how to run my business?" he sneered. "You think you know better than me? You don't know a damn thing." Anna didn't back down. She met his glare with one of her own. "I know that what you're doing is wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know that everyone in this place can see it, and if you don't serve him, then you're going to have to deal with more than just me." Roy's face twisted into a snarl. He looked around the diner, saw the eyes on him, the judgment in their faces. He turned back to me, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're something special now?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You think just because you're siding with them, you're better than me?" I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I'd never seen Roy like this, so full of rage. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. "I just think he deserves to be treated like anyone else," I managed to say, my voice trembling. Roy stepped closer, his eyes boring into mine. "You want to take his side?" he whispered, so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Fine. But remember, you work for me, and I don't pay you to think. You hear me?" I nodded, swallowing hard. I knew I had pushed too far, but something inside me refused to back down completely. Roy glared at me for another moment, then turned back to the young man. "Last chance," he said, his voice cold. "Get out or I'll make you." The young man didn't move. He held Roy's gaze unflinching. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not until I get my coffee." I could feel the room holding its breath, waiting to see what Roy would do next. And in that moment, I knew that everything was about to change. Roy's face twisted with fury. I could see the veins bulging on his neck, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. He looked around the room again, gauging the crowd, but the faces staring back at him weren't friendly. Even his regulars were watching with discomfort, a few whispering to each other. The young man, still calm and collected, sat there like a stone, not budging an inch. Anna stayed on her feet, eyes blazing, her hands trembling but her voice steady. Roy was breathing heavily now, and I could see he was losing control. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, weighing his options. He was always a bully, but he thrived on the crowd's silence, on fear. Today was different. Today, people weren't looking away. They were staring, waiting to see what he'd do. Roy pointed a shaking finger at the young man. "I'm calling the cops," he declared loudly, his voice cracking. "You don't leave, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing. You hear me?" The young man didn't even blink. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Call them. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just sitting here, like everyone else." Roy's eyes darted around, desperate now, searching for someone to back him up. But the diner was silent. Even the sound of the coffee machine seemed to fade into the background. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand was shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "This is on you," he muttered under his breath, glaring at me before turning away and dialing. "You'll see what happens." The seconds felt like hours. I watched Roy's face as he spoke to the dispatcher, his voice tight with anger. When he hung up, he turned back to the young man. "You've got a few minutes before they get here," he said, trying to regain some composure. "Better think hard about your next move." The young man didn't respond. He just looked at Anna, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Then he glanced over at me. I felt something stir inside me, a mix of fear and shame. I knew I had a choice to make, but I wasn't sure if I had the courage. Minutes passed. The tension was unbearable. I could feel sweat dripping down my back and my hands were still shaking. Anna sat back down, but her posture was straight, defiant. She wasn't going anywhere. Then the bell above the diner door jingled, and two officers walked in. One was a young woman with a stern expression, the other a middle-aged man who looked like he'd seen it all before. They approached Roy, who immediately launched into his version of events. "There he is," Roy said, pointing at the young man like he was pointing out a suspect in a lineup. "This guy came in here causing trouble, refused to leave when I asked. He's trespassing. I want him out of my diner." The officers looked at each other, then at the young man, who sat calmly, his hands resting on the counter. The older officer, who had gray at his temples and a tired look in his eyes, spoke first. "Sir, can I see some identification?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The young man nodded, reaching slowly into his pocket to pull out his wallet. He handed over his ID without a word, his movements measured and calm. The officer glanced at the ID, his expression shifting slightly as he read it. His partner leaned over to see, and her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Is there a problem, officer?" the young man asked, still calm, still composed. The older officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Williams," he began, "we got a call about a disturbance, but from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just sitting here, minding your own business." Roy's face turned a deeper shade of red. "He's not just sitting here," he sputtered. "He's refusing to leave when I told him to." The officer turned to Roy, his expression hardening. "And what reason did you give him for needing to leave?" Roy hesitated. "I don't need a reason," he snapped. "This is my place. I decide who stays and who goes." The officer sighed, turning back to the young man. "Sir, would you like to press any charges against the owner here for harassment?" I felt a shock run through me. The officer was asking if the young man wanted to press charges against Roy. I hadn't seen that coming. The room went even quieter, all eyes now on the young man. He shook his head slowly. "No, officer. I'm not looking to cause any trouble. I just wanted a cup of coffee. But it seems like that's not possible here today." The younger officer, still holding his ID, nodded slowly. "You're not causing any trouble, sir. In fact, you have every right to be here. We could talk about discrimination if you'd like to take it further." I watched Roy's face. He looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He thought the police would be on his side, thought they'd back him up and toss the young man out without question. But the older officer shook his head slightly. "It seems to me," he said, his voice steady, "that this gentleman isn't doing anything wrong. You, on the other hand, might want to think about how you're treating people in your establishment." Roy's face fell, and for the first time since the whole mess started, he looked truly lost, like he didn't know what to say. I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. The officers handed back the young man's ID and gave a nod of respect. "You have a good day, Mr. Williams," the older one said. "Sorry for the inconvenience." And with that, they turned and left, the door swinging shut behind them. The young man turned to Roy, a small, almost sad smile on his face. "All I wanted was a coffee," he said softly. "That's all. Think about that, Mr. Roy." Roy stood there, frozen, as the young man got up, put some money on the counter, and walked out of the diner. The room remained silent, every eye on Roy, waiting to see what he'd do next. I knew right then that nothing in that diner would ever be the same again. And I felt something inside me shift, a decision forming in my mind. The fear was still there, but it was starting to lose its grip. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stand up for what was right. The door closed behind the young man, and the silence in the diner was deafening. Roy stood there, staring at the counter where the money lay, like it was some kind of insult. His face was a mix of confusion, anger, and something else. Maybe fear, though I'd never seen him look afraid before. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Anna broke the silence first. She leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "You can't keep doing this, Roy," she said, her eyes locked on his. "People see what you're doing. We all see it." Roy turned to her, his face twisted in anger. "You think you know what goes on around here?" He shot back, his voice shaking. "You think you're better than me?" Anna didn't flinch. "I think you're losing customers," she replied calmly. "And I think you're losing more than that." Roy seemed taken aback by her words, like he hadn't expected anyone to stand up to him. For a moment, I thought he might lash out again, but then his shoulders slumped, and he turned away, muttering something under his breath. The other customers began to stir, a low murmur spreading through the room. Some of them got up and left. Others kept watching, their eyes moving back and forth between Roy and me, like they were expecting some kind of showdown. I could feel their eyes on me, feel the heat rising in my face. I knew I had to say something. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Roy," I started, my voice louder than I intended. "This isn't right. You know it's not." He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to tell me what's right?" he snapped. "You're just a kid who washes dishes. Don't think you can tell me how to run my business." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "I don't need to tell you how to run it," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "But I can tell you that what you're doing isn't fair. It isn't right to treat people like that." Roy stared at me, his mouth set in a thin line. "You want to leave too?" he asked, his voice cold. "You want to walk out like that, punk?" I hesitated. I needed the job. I needed the money. But I also needed to be able to look at myself in the mirror. I thought about the young man's face, the way he'd held his ground, the way he hadn't backed down, even when it would have been easier. "I don't want to leave," I said slowly, "but I can't stay here if this is how it's going to be." Roy's eyes flashed with anger. "Then get out!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "Get out of my diner and don't come back!" I felt a wave of panic wash over me, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I looked around at the other customers, saw the uncertainty on their faces, the mixture of shock and discomfort. Anna was still sitting there watching me, her face calm but determined. She gave me a small nod, like she was encouraging me, telling me it was okay. I took a deep breath and nodded back. "Okay," I said quietly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Okay, I'm going." I walked over to the counter, untied my apron, and set it down. I could feel my legs trembling, but I kept moving. Roy was still standing there, glaring at me, but I didn't look back at him. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, turned around, and looked at him one last time. "I hope you think about what happened today," I said, my voice steady now. "I hope you realize that you're pushing people away. You're pushing them all away." And with that, I turned and walked out, the bell above the door ringing as I pushed it open. Outside, the air felt cool and fresh against my skin. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and relief. I had just walked away from my job, from the only source of income I had, and I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd done something right. I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go. I could hear the sounds of the city around me, cars passing by, people talking, life going on. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Anna standing there. "You did the right thing," she said softly, her eyes kind. It took a lot of courage to stand up to him like that. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know what I'm going to do now," I admitted, the fear creeping back in. "I don't have another job lined up. I don't have a plan." Anna smiled gently. "You don't need to have it all figured out right now," she said. "Just know that you did something important today. And if you need help, there are people who will stand with you." I felt a surge of gratitude and gave her a small, shaky smile. "Thanks," I murmured, not sure what else to say. As Anna walked back into the diner, I turned and started walking down the street, my mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. The fear was still there, but it was lighter now, mixed with something else, something that felt like hope. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like I was moving in the right direction. And I knew, deep down, that whatever came next, I'd face it with my head held high. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy heart. The reality of what I'd done was beginning to set in. I lay there for a while, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of my small apartment, wondering how I was going to make it through the week without a paycheck. My stomach growled, reminding me that I'd skipped dinner the night before. The fridge was almost empty, and I knew I had to be careful with what little money I had left. I got up, washed my face, and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. "You did the right thing," I whispered to myself, trying to believe it. But doubt crept in, and I felt a wave of uncertainty. Was standing up to Roy worth losing everything? I wasn't sure, but there was no going back now. I had to figure out my next move. I decided to take a walk, clear my head, and see if I could find another job. I headed down to the local community center, hoping they might have some leads or know of any places hiring. The streets were busy with people rushing to work, their faces focused and determined. I felt a pang of envy. I'd always wanted to feel that sense of purpose, to have a place where I belonged. At the community center, I found a job board covered with flyers and notices. Most of them were for things I didn't have the skills for: construction, office work, specialized trades. But one flyer caught my eye. It was handwritten and tacked to the side of the board. Volunteer needed, community outreach program. Help make a difference. No experience required. Inquire inside. I hesitated for a moment. Volunteering wouldn't pay the bills, but maybe it was a start. Maybe I could meet people, make connections, find a new direction. I figured I had nothing to lose, so I took a deep breath and walked up to the front desk. A middle-aged woman with warm eyes looked up from her paperwork. "Can I help you?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Yeah, I saw the flyer about the volunteer position," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I was wondering if it's still open." She nodded. "Absolutely. We're always looking for more hands to help out. It's for a community outreach program we're running, trying to connect with local residents, offer support, and provide services to those in need. Are you interested?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I'd like to give it a try." "Great," she said, her smile widening. "My name is Karen, and I coordinate the program. Why don't you come by this afternoon? We could use some help setting up for an event tonight." I agreed and thanked her. As I turned to leave, I felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. I spent the next few hours wandering around, handing out my resume to a few local shops and cafes. Most of them said they weren't hiring, but I knew I had to keep trying. By early afternoon, I headed back to the community center. The place was buzzing with activity. I found Karen organizing a group of volunteers, directing them on where to set up tables and chairs. When she saw me, she waved me over. "Glad you could make it," she said cheerfully. "We're getting ready for a community dinner tonight. It's a way to bring people together, share a meal, and talk about what's going on in the neighborhood. Do you think you could help set up the tables and chairs?" I nodded and got to work, trying to ignore the knots in my stomach. As I arranged chairs and laid out tablecloths, I listened to the conversations around me. The volunteers were talking about all kinds of things: housing issues, job searches, local events. There was a sense of camaraderie, a shared purpose. I felt like I'd stumbled into something I hadn't realized I needed. As the afternoon went on, I started to feel more comfortable. People introduced themselves, asked about me, and shared their own stories. It felt good to be part of something, even if just for a day later. As the community dinner began, I stood at the back, watching as people came in, greeted each other, and sat down to eat. There was laughter, conversation, a sense of connection. I felt a warmth in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Then, I saw him. The young man from the diner, the one Roy had tried to throw out. He was standing by the door talking to a group of people, his face lit up with a smile. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what to do, if he'd even remember me or if he'd want to talk. I watched as he moved through the crowd, greeting people, shaking hands, making everyone feel welcome. Finally, he turned and caught my eye. For a moment, I panicked, thinking about turning and walking away. But he smiled, a friendly, open smile that put me at ease. He walked over and extended his hand. "Hey," he said warmly. "I remember you from the diner. Thanks for what you tried to do back there. That took guts." I shook his hand, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I wish I could have done more," I replied, "but I'm glad to see you here." He nodded. "Yeah, this place is great. It's all about building community, bringing people together. I'm Samuel, by the way." I introduced myself, feeling more at ease. "So, are you involved with the center?" I asked. Samuel nodded. "I've been volunteering here for a few years now, helping out where I can. I think it's important to give back, especially when you've been given so much." I admired his outlook. "That's a good way to see it," I said. "I'm just trying to figure out my next steps, you know? I'm a bit lost right now." Samuel nodded, understanding. "We've all been there, trust me. But this is a good place to start. You'll meet people who care, people who want to make a difference. And who knows, you might find something here that changes everything." As we talked, I felt something shift inside me, a sense that maybe I was in the right place after all, that maybe things would turn out okay. I didn't have a job, didn't know where my next meal was coming from, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Samuel patted me on the shoulder. "Come on," he said with a grin. "Let me introduce you to some folks. You never know where a conversation might lead." And so, I followed him into the crowd, feeling lighter than I had in days, ready to take whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, I found myself at the community center almost every day. I'd get up early, grab whatever food I could find, and head over to help with whatever needed doing, setting up chairs, serving food, talking to folks who needed someone to listen. The work wasn't glamorous, but it felt real, like it mattered. And each day, I learned a little more about the people around me, their struggles, and their dreams. Samuel turned out to be someone I looked up to more than I expected. He had this way of talking to people that made them feel seen, important, like they were the only ones in the room. He was always on the move, organizing events, speaking at meetings, getting things done. It was clear that he had a vision for this community, and people gravitated toward him. He'd smile at me whenever he saw me, encouraging me with a pat on the back or a few words of support. One day, he pulled me aside after we finished setting up for another community dinner. "You know," he said, "I've been watching you, and I think you've got more to offer than just setting up tables. We could use someone like you with a bit more responsibility." I blinked, surprised. "Like what?" I asked, unsure of where this was going. He grinned. "Well, how do you feel about helping us with outreach, talking to folks, letting them know what we're doing here, bringing more people into the fold? You've got a way about you that's genuine. People can tell when you're being real, and that's what we need." I felt a rush of doubt. "I don't know, Samuel. I've never done anything like that before. I'm just trying to find my way." He nodded, understanding. "That's exactly why you should do it. You're honest, and that's what people respond to. Look, it doesn't have to be complicated. Just go out there, share your story, let people know they're welcome here." I hesitated, but Samuel's words made sense. "I can try," I said slowly, "but I don't know how good I'll be." He smiled. "That's all I'm asking for. Just try. And don't worry about being perfect. No one is." The next day, I found myself standing on the corner of a busy street with a handful of flyers, trying to figure out how to start a conversation with strangers. My stomach was tight with nerves. I watched people walk by, some in a rush, others moving slowly, lost in their own thoughts. For a moment, I considered giving up. But then I remembered Samuel's words. Just try. I took a deep breath and approached the first person I saw, a middle-aged woman carrying a bag of groceries. "Hi there," I began awkwardly, holding out a flyer. "I'm with the community center just down the block. We're having an event this weekend and I wanted to invite you to come by." She looked at me, surprised, then at the flyer. Her face softened a bit, and she took it. "Oh, I've heard about that place," she said. "What kind of event?" I relaxed a little. "It's a community dinner," I explained. "Free food, some good conversation. We're trying to bring people together, you know." She nodded. "That sounds nice. I might stop by." I smiled, feeling a small victory in my chest. "Great! We'd love to have you." As she walked away, I felt a wave of relief and excitement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent the rest of the day handing out flyers, talking to people, telling them about the center and what we were trying to do. Some were interested, others weren't, but I kept going, feeling more confident with each conversation. Later that afternoon, I found myself outside a local grocery store, handing out the last of my flyers. I was tired but felt good, like I'd done something worthwhile. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "You're that guy from the diner, aren't you?" I turned around to see a man standing there, his face familiar. He was one of the customers who had been at the diner the day Roy kicked out the young man. He had been sitting quietly at the time, but now he was looking at me with curiosity. Yeah, I admitted, feeling a little uncertain. That was me. He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. I remember you, he said. You stood up to that guy, Roy. That took guts. I shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed. I just couldn't stay silent, you know? The man nodded. Not many would have done that. I was watching, and I thought you were going to get yourself in trouble, but you did the right thing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. Listen, I run a local paper, and we're always looking for stories about people who are making a difference. How about we do a piece on the community center and the work you're doing there? I blinked in surprise. Really? I asked, not sure if I'd heard him right. Absolutely, he said. People need to hear about this kind of stuff. Positive news, you know. I felt a smile spread across my face. That sounds great, I replied, feeling a swell of pride. I'd be happy to talk about what we're doing. We agreed to meet the next day for an interview. I walked back to the community center, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. As I walked in, Samuel spotted me and came over, curious about the smile on my face. What's going on? He asked, his eyes bright. I laughed. You won't believe it, I said. A guy from the local paper wants to do a story on the center. He saw what happened at the diner and wants to write about what we're doing here. Samuel's face lit up. That's fantastic, he exclaimed. This could really bring some attention to our work, get more people involved. You did that, man. I felt a mix of excitement and disbelief. I guess so, I replied. I just talked to people, told them the truth. Samuel nodded, clapping me on the back. That's all it takes sometimes. Just being real. Keep it up, and who knows where this might lead. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path, like I was doing something that mattered. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was ready to find out. I had a chance to start fresh, to build something new, and I wasn't going to waste it. The interview with the local paper came sooner than I expected. I found myself sitting across from the reporter, the same man who had seen me at the diner. His name was Mike, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We met at the community center, in a small room that doubled as an office for Samuel and the other volunteers. The walls were covered with posters about local events, job fairs, and support services, a reminder of all the work that still needed to be done. So, tell me, Mike began, his pen poised over his notebook. What brought you to the community center? How did you get involved? I hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to start. I guess it all started with that day at the diner, I said slowly. I'd been working there for a while, trying to keep my head down, you know, just get through the day. But when Roy threw that guy out, I don't know, something snapped inside me. I couldn't just stand there and watch anymore. Mike nodded, jotting down notes. And that's when you decided to leave? I nodded. Yeah, I didn't have a plan or anything. I just knew I couldn't stay there anymore. And then I found this place. I gestured around the room, and it felt like a lifeline, like a place where I could do some good. He smiled, encouraging me to continue. And what have you been doing here? Mostly just helping out however I can, I explained. At first it was just setting up for events, serving food, things like that. But Samuel, one of the organizers, he saw something in me. He asked me to help with outreach, to talk to people, bring them in, let them know they're welcome here. Mike looked intrigued. And how's that been going? I smiled, feeling a little more confident. Better than I expected. People are more open than I thought they'd be. They want to connect. They want to be part of something. And I think they see that this place is different, that it's not about judgment or exclusion. It's about community, about helping each other out. Mike's pen moved quickly over the page. It sounds like you've found something meaningful here, he observed. I nodded. Yeah, I have. I didn't realize how much I needed this. How much I needed to feel like I belonged somewhere, like I was doing something that mattered. And now I'm just trying to take it one day at a time, see where it leads. Mike smiled. I think a lot of people will connect with that, he said. Your story is about change, about standing up when it's hard, and I think that'll resonate with our readers. The interview wrapped up soon after that, and Mike promised to let me know when the article would be published. As he left, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but maybe this was an opportunity to shine some light on the good work happening here. A few days later, the article came out. The headline read, "From Division to Unity, a new voice at the heart of our community." My heart raced as I read the words, seeing my own story reflected back at me. Mike had done a good job capturing the spirit of the community center and the work we were doing. He'd written about the day at the diner, about my decision to leave, and about how I'd found a new purpose at the center. I wasn't the only one reading the article. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood had seen it. People I'd never met before started stopping by the center, asking questions, wanting to know more. The next community dinner was packed. I saw faces I'd never seen before, people from all walks of life. It was amazing to see how quickly things were changing. Samuel found me that evening, a huge grin on his face. "You did it, man," he said, clapping me on the back. "This is all because of you. That article is bringing in so many people, more than we ever expected." I laughed, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I didn't do much," I protested. "Just talked to a reporter." He shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You stood up for what's right, and you told your story. People can see that, and they want to be part of it." We walked around the crowded room, greeting people, welcoming them in. I felt a sense of pride, of belonging. I was no longer the guy in the background, the guy who just washed dishes and kept his head down. I was part of something bigger, something meaningful. A few days later, I got a call from an unexpected person, Anna. I hadn't seen her since the day I left the diner, and hearing her voice on the other end of the line brought back a flood of memories. "Hey," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "I read the article about you in the paper. It was really inspiring." I smiled, surprised. "Thanks, Anna. I didn't know you'd seen it." "Oh, everyone's seen it," she laughed. "You're kind of famous around here now." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I don't know about that." "No, really," she insisted. "You did a good thing. And I wanted to tell you I quit the diner too." My eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Why?" She sighed. "I couldn't stay there after what happened. After seeing how Roy treated people, I realized I'd been looking the other way for too long. I needed a change." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. "I'm glad you did," I said. "You deserve better than that place." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking. I'd like to help out at the community center if you'd have me. I don't have a lot of experience, but I'm willing to learn." I felt a smile spread across my face. "We'd love to have you, Anna. Come by any time. We could always use more hands." She laughed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I'll be there tomorrow," she promised. The next day, Anna showed up at the community center, ready to dive in. She was nervous, but I could see a determination in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Samuel welcomed her warmly, and I introduced her to some of the other volunteers. She fit in easily, her kindness and openness winning people over right away. Over the weeks that followed, Anna and I became closer. We shared stories about our pasts, our dreams, our fears. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the way she'd smile when she talked about her favorite books or her love for baking. I realized that I hadn't felt this kind of connection with anyone in a long time. And then one evening, after a long day of work, we found ourselves sitting outside the community center, watching the sunset. The sky was a deep orange, fading into pink, and the air was cool and calm. We sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the moment. "You know," Anna said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd find a place like this, a place where I could just be myself." I nodded, feeling the same. "Me neither," I admitted. "But I'm glad we're both here." She turned to me, her eyes bright in the fading light. "So what's next for you?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" I thought for a moment, taking in the question. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But for the first time, I feel like I have options, like I can make choices that mean something, and that's enough for now." Anna smiled. "Yeah," she agreed. "That's enough." We sat there a little longer side by side, watching the last light of the day fade into the night, knowing that whatever came next, we would face it together. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. The days at the community center began to pass quickly, each one filled with more people, more stories, and more opportunities. Anna settled in like she had always belonged, her laughter filling the rooms as she worked with the volunteers. I could see the change in her, just as I could feel the change in myself. The center was no longer just a place to pass the time. It was becoming a part of who we were. One morning, Samuel approached me with a serious look on his face. "Hey," he began, "we need to talk about something important." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What's up?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He took a deep breath. "There's a funding issue," he said. "The city is considering cutting our grant, and if that happens, we might not be able to keep the center open. We're going to have to find a way to raise some money and fast." I felt my heart sink. The idea of losing the center, of losing this place that had become my home, filled me with a deep fear. "What can we do?" I asked. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "We've got to organize a fundraiser, something big, something that will draw people in. I was hoping you could help." "Of course," I said without hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" Samuel smiled, relieved. "I knew I could count on you. We're thinking of hosting a community fair, games, food, music, the works. But we need people to spread the word, get local businesses involved, find some entertainment. You've been great at outreach. Think you're up for it?" I nodded, even as nerves fluttered in my stomach. "Yeah, I'm up for it," I said, feeling the weight of the challenge. "I'll start reaching out today." For the next few days, I threw myself into planning the fundraiser. I talked to local businesses, asking them to donate prizes or sponsor booths. I went door to door, handing out flyers, explaining what the center meant to me, to all of us, and how much we needed the support. I even convinced a few local bands to volunteer their time and play at the event. Anna was right there beside me, helping with the planning, calling vendors, organizing volunteers. Her energy was infectious, and her enthusiasm kept me going when the doubts started to creep in. "We've got this," she'd say with a smile. "People want to help. They just need to know how." A few days before the event, Samuel gathered us all together. "You've done an amazing job," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I've talked to some folks at the city, and they're going to send someone to check out the fair. If we can show them how much support we have, we might just convince them to keep the funding going." I felt a surge of hope, but also a rush of pressure. This had to go well. We had to prove that the center mattered, that it was worth saving. As the day of the fair approached, I could barely sleep. I lay awake, going over every detail in my mind, worried that something would go wrong. Finally, the morning of the fundraiser arrived. The sky was clear and bright, the perfect day for a community event. We set up early, transforming the empty lot next to the center into a lively fairground. There were booths with games and prizes, tables piled high with food, and a small stage for the bands. Volunteers bustled around, stringing up colorful banners, laying out chairs, and making sure everything was in place. By noon, people began to arrive, families with children, groups of teenagers, elderly couples holding hands, all kinds of people from the neighborhood and beyond. I felt a wave of relief as I saw the crowd grow, heard the sound of laughter and conversation filling the air. The fair was in full swing, and it was better than I could have hoped for. Kids were running around playing games, their faces painted with bright colors. The smell of grilled food filled the air, and the bands were setting up on stage, ready to start playing. It felt like a real celebration, a testament to what the community center had become. As I walked through the crowd, greeting people, thanking them for coming, I saw a familiar face, Mike, the reporter from the local paper. He waved me over, a smile on his face. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," he said. "Looks like a great turnout." "Thanks," I replied, grinning. "We're hoping it'll be enough to convince the city to keep our funding." Mike nodded. "I've been hearing a lot of positive buzz about the center lately. I think you've got a good chance." I thanked him, feeling a bit more hopeful. But as the afternoon went on, I began to notice someone else in the crowd, a tall man in a suit, watching everything with a keen eye. I realized he must be the representative from the city, here to assess the event. My stomach tightened. This was it. This was our chance. I decided to approach him, to make sure he knew how much this place meant to all of us. "Hi," I said, offering my hand. "I'm glad you could make it. I'm one of the volunteers here. This place has changed my life, and I know it's done the same for so many others." He shook my hand, his expression polite but reserved. "I'm just here to observe," he replied, "but I'm impressed with what I've seen so far." I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. "I hope you see how much this place means to people. We're really hoping the city will continue to support us." He gave a small smile. "Well, events like this certainly help make the case," he said. "I'll be taking everything I see here back to the council." I thanked him and walked away, feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. I found Anna near the food stands chatting with some of the volunteers. She saw the look on my face and immediately came over. "How did it go?" she asked. I shrugged. "I don't know," I admitted. "He was hard to read, but I think he's impressed." She smiled, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. "You did great. Now, let's just enjoy the day and see what happens." The day wore on, and as the sun began to set, the fair showed no signs of slowing down. The bands played their final sets, and the crowd cheered. People stayed, talking, laughing, connecting. I realized that whatever happened with the funding, we'd already accomplished something important. We'd brought people together. Finally, as the event began to wind down, Samuel called everyone to the stage. He grabbed the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. "I just want to say thank you," he began, "to all of you for coming, for supporting this center, for believing in what we're trying to do. This place is about more than just walls and a roof. It's about people, about community, about hope." The crowd erupted into applause, and I felt a lump in my throat. I looked over at Anna, who was clapping and smiling, her eyes bright. I realized in that moment how much this place meant to me, how much these people meant to me. As the fair came to a close, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the city representative standing behind me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for showing me what this place is all about. You've made a strong case today." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I'll be honest with you," he continued. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm leaving here impressed. I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can to make sure this center gets the support it deserves." I felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That's all we can ask for." He smiled and nodded before walking away, leaving me standing there, feeling lighter than I had in days. I turned to find Anna beside me, her face filled with hope. Think it'll be enough? She asked softly. I nodded, a smile spreading across my face. Yeah, I said. I think it might just be. And for the first time, I felt truly at peace. We'd done everything we could, and whatever happened next, we'd face it together. I reached out and took Anna's hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers in mine. As we stood there, watching the last of the fairgoers leave, I realized that this was more than just a fundraiser, more than just an event. It was a beginning, a new beginning for all of us. And I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing I wasn't alone anymore. The days following the fundraiser were filled with a mix of anxious anticipation and cautious optimism. The turnout had been better than any of us had hoped, and the energy in the community was palpable. People kept stopping by the center, asking how they could help, wanting to be involved in whatever came next. But the question of funding still hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I could feel the tension building among the volunteers. Every morning, Samuel would call the city council office trying to get an update, but there was never any news, just vague answers and polite promises to call back soon. It was frustrating, to say the least, and each day that passed without word felt like a weight pressing down on all of us. One afternoon, I was helping Anna organize some new donations we'd received from local businesses: blankets, canned food, and supplies for the outreach programs, when Samuel walked in, a serious look on his face. Got a call from the city, he said, his voice steady but his expression hard to read. I felt my heart stop for a second, waiting for him to continue. They want to meet with us, tomorrow afternoon. I exhaled, the tension leaving my body all at once. Is that good? I asked. What do you think? Samuel shrugged. Hard to say. They didn't give much away on the phone, just said they wanted to discuss the center's future. But at least we're getting a meeting. Anna nodded, her face thoughtful. It could be a good sign, she suggested. Maybe they saw what we did at the fair and want to work with us. I hoped she was right. I'd been trying to stay positive. Of us. Hi, I said, offering my hand. I'm glad you could make it. I'm one of the volunteers here. This place has changed my life, and I know it's done the same for so many others. He shook my hand, his expression polite, but reserved. I'm just here to observe, he replied. But I'm impressed with what I've seen so far. I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. I hope you see how much this place means to people. We're really hoping the city will continue to support us. He gave a small smile. Well, events like this certainly help make the case, he said. I'll be taking everything I see here back to the council. I thanked him and walked away, feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. I found Anna near the food stands, chatting with some of the volunteers. She saw the look on my face and immediately came over. How did it go? She asked. I shrugged. I don't know, I admitted. He was hard to read, but I think he's impressed. She smiled, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. You did great. Now, let's just enjoy the day and see what happens. The day wore on, and as the sun began to set, the fair showed no signs of slowing down. The bands played their final sets and the crowd cheered. People stayed, talking, laughing, connecting. I realized that whatever happened with the funding, we'd already accomplished something important. We'd brought people together. Finally, as the event began to wind down, Samuel called everyone to the stage. He grabbed the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. I just want to say thank you, he began, to all of you for coming, for supporting this center, for believing in what we're trying to do. This place is about more than just walls and a roof. It's about people, about community, about hope. The crowd erupted into applause, and I felt a lump in my throat. I looked over at Anna, who was clapping and smiling, her eyes bright. I realized in that moment how much this place meant to me, how much these people meant to me. As the fair came to a close, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the city representative standing behind me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for showing me what this place is all about. You've made a strong case today." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I'll be honest with you," he continued. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm leaving here impressed. I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can to make sure this center gets the support it deserves." I felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That's all we can ask for." He smiled and nodded before walking away, leaving me standing there, feeling lighter than I had in days. I turned to find Anna beside me, her face filled with hope. "Think it'll be enough?" she asked softly. I nodded, a smile spreading across my face. "Yeah," I said, "I think it might just be." And for the first time, I felt truly at peace. We'd done everything we could, and whatever happened next, we'd face it together. I reached out and took Anna's hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers in mine. As we stood there, watching the last of the fairgoers leave, I realized that this was more than just a fundraiser, more than just an event. It was a beginning, a new beginning for all of us. And I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing I wasn't alone anymore. The days following the fundraiser were filled with a mix of anxious anticipation and cautious optimism. The turnout had been better than any of us had hoped, and the energy in the community was palpable. People kept stopping by the center, asking how they could help, wanting to be involved in whatever came next. But the question of funding still hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I could feel the tension building among the volunteers. Every morning, Samuel would call the city council office, trying to get an update, but there was never any news. Just vague answers and polite promises to call back soon. It was frustrating, to say the least, and each day that passed without word felt like a weight pressing down on all of us. One afternoon, I was helping Anna organize some new donations we'd received from local businesses, blankets, canned food, and supplies for the outreach programs, when Samuel walked in, a serious look on his face. "Got a call from the city," he said, his voice steady but his expression hard to read. I felt my heart stop for a second, waiting for him to continue. "They want to meet with us tomorrow afternoon." I exhaled, the tension leaving my body all at once. "Is that good?" I asked. "What do you think?" Samuel shrugged. "Hard to say. They didn't give much away on the phone, just said they wanted to discuss the center's future. But at least we're getting a meeting." Anna nodded, her face thoughtful. "It could be a good sign," she suggested. "Maybe they saw what we did at the fair and want to work with us." I hoped she was right. I'd been trying to stay positive, but the uncertainty was eating away at me. "So, what do we need to do to prepare?" I asked, eager to have something to focus on. Samuel smiled faintly. "Just be ready to talk about what we've been doing here, the impact we've had, and why this place matters. We've got to make them see that this isn't just some building, but a lifeline for a lot of people." We spent the rest of the day going over everything, the programs we offered, the people we'd helped, the difference we'd made. By the time I headed home, I felt a strange mixture of hope and fear, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next day, the meeting was set for 3 p.m. I arrived early, my stomach tight with nerves. The city council offices were busy, people moving about with purpose, and I felt out of place, like I didn't belong in a world of polished floors and suits. Samuel and Anna arrived shortly after, both looking as anxious as I felt. We were shown to a conference room where a few council members were already seated. The man who had attended the fair, the one in the suit with the reserved expression, sat at the head of the table. He introduced himself as Mr. Harris and gestured for us to sit down. "We appreciate you coming in today," Mr. Harris began. "After seeing the event you put on, we wanted to talk more about what you're doing at the community center and how it fits with our goals for the neighborhood." Samuel nodded, his face calm, but serious. Thank you for having us. We're glad to have the chance to show you why this place is so important. It's not just about the programs we run. It's about the community we're building, the connections we're fostering, and the support we're providing to those who need it most. Anna chimed in, her voice steady. We've seen firsthand how much this center means to people. It's a place where they can come, feel safe, and find a sense of belonging. We've helped families find housing, offered job training, provided meals, and that's just the start. Mr. Harris nodded, his face thoughtful. I saw that at the fair. There's no doubt you've done good work. But there are concerns about sustainability. The city needs to know that this isn't just a temporary solution. How do you plan to keep this going long term? Samuel leaned forward, his expression earnest. We're committed to building partnerships with local businesses, applying for grants, and getting more community members involved. The fair showed us that there's a lot of support out there. People want to help. They just need the opportunity. There was a long pause, and I could feel the tension in the room. Mr. Harris exchanged a look with the other council members, then leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest, he said slowly. There's been a lot of debate about the funding. Some think the money could be better spent elsewhere, on projects with more immediate results. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. I understand that, I said, speaking up for the first time. But immediate results aren't always the most important ones. What we're doing here, it's about the long game. It's about giving people the tools and support they need to build better lives. That doesn't happen overnight. Mr. Harris looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing my words. I respect that, he said finally, and I see your point. But there are still concerns. We need to ensure that every dollar spent is making a measurable impact. Samuel nodded. We're more than willing to work with the city to develop metrics, to show you exactly how we're making a difference. We just need a chance. The room was quiet for a moment, and I felt like I was holding my breath. Then Mr. Harris leaned forward, a small smile on his face. All right, he said. Here's what we'll do. We're going to extend your funding for another 6 months. During that time, we'll work with you to develop a plan, to measure impact, and to find sustainable ways to keep this center running. If we see progress, if we see growth, we'll consider extending it further. A rush of relief washed over me, and I heard Anna let out a breath she'd been holding. Samuel smiled, a look of gratitude on his face. Thank you, he said. That's all we ask for, a chance to prove ourselves. Mr. Harris nodded. You've got it, and I hope you make the most of it. We left the meeting with a mix of emotions, relief, excitement, and a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start, a chance to keep going, to keep building. As we walked out of the council building, Anna turned to me, a smile on her face. We did it, she whispered, her eyes shining with excitement. We really did it. I grinned back at her, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Yeah, I agreed. But now the real work begins. Samuel laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. You're right about that, he said. But if we can pull off that fair, we can do anything. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into the work. We developed new programs, reached out to more people, and strengthened our partnerships. Every day the center seemed to grow, to become more vibrant, more alive. People from all walks of life came through our doors, each one bringing their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes. Anna and I grew closer too. We spent more time together, not just at the center, but outside of it, sharing meals, talking late into the night, dreaming about the future. I realized how much I'd come to depend on her, how much her presence meant to me. She was strong, compassionate, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. One evening, after a long day, we found ourselves back at the spot where we'd watched the sun set weeks before. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, and the air was cool and fresh. I've been thinking, Anna said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. About what you said, about making choices that mean something. I looked at her, curious. Yeah? She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I want to do that too. I want to be part of something bigger, something that makes a difference. And I think I've found that here, with you, with all of this. My heart swelled, and I felt a warmth spreading through me. I feel the same way, I admitted. I never thought I'd find a place where I felt like I belonged, but here we are. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. Here we are, she echoed, and I'm glad we're here together. We sat there, watching as the last light faded from the sky, knowing that we had a lot of work ahead of us, but feeling ready for whatever came next. Because whatever happened, we knew we were in it together. And that was enough. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, on a new path, with new people, building something that truly mattered. And for the first time, I felt like the future was full of possibilities. The next 6 months flew by faster than I could have imagined. The days at the community center were a blur of activity, meetings, and outreach efforts. We worked harder than ever, knowing that our future depended on the progress we could make, the impact we could show. There was a sense of urgency, but also a sense of purpose. Each day felt meaningful, every task a step toward something bigger. The community kept showing up, more people getting involved, bringing their friends and neighbors, spreading the word. We started new programs, free tutoring for kids, job training workshops, a food pantry. The center was buzzing with life. You could feel the energy in the air, a feeling of hope, like we were all building something special together. Samuel was everywhere, managing details, smoothing out problems, and always with a smile. Anna was like a light that drew people in, her warmth and positivity infectious. I found my own role growing too. I was speaking at events, organizing volunteer drives, and even leading a few workshops myself. The nervousness I'd felt in the beginning had started to fade, replaced by confidence and a belief in what we were doing. One day, as I was preparing for a meeting with some local business owners about potential partnerships, Samuel pulled me aside. "You've been doing incredible work, you know that?" he said, a grin spreading across his face. I felt my cheeks flush with pride. "Thanks, Samuel. It means a lot coming from you. But it's a team effort. We couldn't have done this without everyone pitching in." He nodded. "True, but you've brought something special to the table, a passion and a sincerity that people respond to. I've been thinking, I'd like you to take on a more formal role here, maybe even become a co-coordinator with me. You've earned it." I stared at him, stunned. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Dead serious," he replied. "You've shown commitment, leadership, and a real love for this community. I think you're the right person for it." I felt a surge of emotion, a mix of gratitude, pride, and disbelief. "I'd be honored," I finally managed to say. "I'll do my best, I promise." Samuel clapped me on the shoulder. "I know you will," he said with a smile. "Now, let's go make those business owners fall in love with us." The meeting went better than I could have hoped. The business owners agreed to partner with the center, providing both financial support and volunteers for our programs. It was a huge win, and as we left the meeting, I felt a wave of relief and excitement. Maybe, just maybe, we could pull this off after all. That evening, we decided to celebrate. We gathered at the community center, the volunteers and staff, along with some of the people we'd helped over the past months. There was food, music, and laughter, a sense of togetherness that filled the room. Anna found me in the crowd, a bright smile on her face. "I heard about the meeting," she said. "That's amazing." I grinned, feeling a rush of joy. "It was a team effort," I replied. "But yeah, it feels good. Feels like we're finally moving in the right direction." She nodded, her eyes shining. I'm so proud of you, she said softly. You've come so far, and I'm so glad to be part of this with you. I felt my heart swell. I'm glad you're here too, Anna, I said. I don't think I could have done any of this without you. She laughed. Oh, I don't know about that, but I'm happy to be by your side. We stood there, watching the celebration around us, feeling the warmth and connection that had grown between us. It felt like a promise, like we were standing at the start of something beautiful. The next day, we received the call we had been waiting for. Mr. Harris wanted to meet with us again, but this time he sounded different, more upbeat, almost excited. When we arrived at the city council office, he greeted us with a smile. I have some good news, he began. The council has reviewed your progress over the past 6 months, and we're impressed. The programs you've implemented, the partnerships you've built, it's exactly what we were hoping to see. I felt a surge of anticipation. Does this mean? He nodded. Yes, we've decided to extend your funding indefinitely. You'll receive the full support of the city moving forward. We're proud to have the community center as a partner in improving the neighborhood. The room erupted in cheers. I felt Anna's arms wrap around me in a tight hug, and I laughed, a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Samuel was beaming. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving us this chance. We won't let you down. Mr. Harris smiled. I don't think you will. Keep up the great work. When we left the office, we could hardly contain our excitement. Samuel laughed out loud, a sound of pure joy. We did it, he shouted, throwing his arms around me and Anna. We really did it. Anna turned to me, her eyes bright with tears. I can't believe it, she whispered. This place, it's going to be okay. I nodded, feeling overwhelmed with emotion. Yeah, I agreed. It's going to be okay. Over the next few weeks, the center continued to grow. We launched new programs, expanded our reach, and deepened our impact. The community rallied around us, and every day brought new faces, new stories, new reasons to keep going. One evening, as I walked Anna home, she looked at me with a serious expression. What do you think the future holds? She asked. I thought for a moment, considering her question. I don't know, I admitted. But I feel like we're on the right path. I feel like there's so much more we can do, so many more lives we can touch. She smiled. I feel that too, she said softly. And I want to be part of it, whatever comes next. I took her hand, squeezing it gently. You will be, I promised. We're in this together, remember? She nodded, a soft smile on her lips. Together, she echoed. And for the first time, I felt a deep peace settle in my chest. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and unknowns, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had found my place, my purpose, and I had people I cared about by my side. Whatever came next, I knew we would face it head-on, with courage and hope. As we walked down the street, the city lights sparkling around us, I realized that this was just the beginning. A new chapter filled with endless possibilities, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead.